Ladies and gentlemen, gender nonconforming and trans deities, thank you for tuning into the Hoodoisie. We are Chicago and the country's, and quite possibly the Milky Way's only live and live stream radical news show and podcast that's bringing you block, optic, and radical perspectives on culture and politics. And we are keeping it radical in the time of Corona with Pandemic Issues. Pandemic Issues is a weekly series that we teamed up with our good friends at the Southside Weekly to bring you, where we bring you the stories and analysis that our big local media will not on the COVID-19 crisis. I'm your host, Ricardo Gamboa, or Ricardo Gamboa. That's me just switching through my colonized tongues like it's nobody's fucking business. Pronouns are they, them, or wow, you look so fresh coming out of the shower with the sexy wet hair. And I'll let my beautiful co-hosts introduce themselves.
Charles Preston, Audience Engagement Manager for Injustice Watch and Random Twitter Troll. How you doing?
Hey.
Hey everyone, what's up? This is Jackie Serrato, Editor-in-Chief of the Southside Weekly. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Looking forward to the show.
Yes, because we got a dope ass show for you tonight. We are talking housing and homelessness with two of my favorite people in the Chicago social change making and media making world. We have a longtime veteran activist of the city, Andy Thayer. Let's give it up for Andy. Show Andy some of that love. And we have the journalist with the baddest name in the motherfucking reporting game. We got Maya Dukmasova from the Chicago Reader. Let's give it up for Maya. Nice. So let's get started. I introduced Andy first and then Maya, so I'm going to flip it. I'm just going to do something crazy this time. So Maya, let's start with you. Maya, do you ever just, wake up, look in the mirror and say, I am Maya Dukmasova. I have the coolest fucking name in the journalist game?
No, I mean, when I elect to gas myself up, it's usually not because of my name, but I appreciate the appreciation. Usually people are getting all flustered and nervous about saying it. It just, the letters are all there, but I guess It's a confusing one to see. I'm Russian, so that's what that is.
Oh, Trump. Back off, okay? That's not me, all right? But I'm excited because I'm a huge fan queer of your work, so I'm super excited to have you here. And you know what I mean? Actually, and that's what I want to start off on is kind of letting our audience know who you are. I said you're a journalist for the Reader. You've been doing some journalism before that. So just can you talk to us about some of the work that, how you became a journalist and some of the work that you've been doing here in Chicago, because you've been elevating fucking conversations up in this bitch and we need people to know about it.
So I've been in Chicago for almost 7 years, and I pretty much got started writing about housing issues as soon as I got here. My first gig here was an internship with the Chicago Tribune editorial board when I got here in 2013, which was like a kind of a weird and interesting way to enter the media business here, because they told me right off the jump that I wasn't going to get a job there because this was in the wake of all their deep recession layoffs. So they had interns basically come through there doing clerical work and stuff. But I really got to see up close about how the editorial board functions and how they created their opinions that they were publishing every day and stuff. At the same time, there were a bunch of, in 2013, there were a bunch of books that came out about public housing history in the city. And I'd been interested in the subject since college, basically. I had a class fall of my freshman year of college about American urban history. And there was a whole part of it devoted to public housing. Up until that time, I hadn't known anything about public housing in this country. I grew up kind of moving around all over the place in the States after we immigrated. And we lived in a lot of small Appalachian towns with my mom. And I didn't really have I didn't know anything about how housing worked in cities and didn't have any my own experiences with it at all. But this class really opened up, blew my mind in terms of making it clear why it is that we're how poverty was maintained in America, how poverty was racialized in this country, and how housing was sort of like the thing that made it function. That the segregation housing, that housing policies, between redlining, the way public housing developed, the way it was segregated, all that stuff really kind of explained to me why American society is so stratified, why cities look the way they do. And so when I moved to Chicago, I figured there were so many books written about public housing in Chicago, and I figured this was an issue I wanted to know more about. I wanted to know what's happening with this stuff now. And yeah, that's kind of where my interest in this issue comes from and why I write about it. I really think that if you understand housing, how housing works in this country, how home ownership and the world of renting works in this country, you can understand everything you need to know about America and how messed up things are here.
Wow. So you got into public housing in college, and I got into ecstasy and threesomes. We had very different higher education experiences, but go you. I love that you were learning, actually. I was too. It was very different stuff. That's awesome. And then, Andy, I want our audience to get to know who you are. So we've had you on the show before, discussing around homelessness. And it's so funny because on your Wikipedia page, it talks about how you are a queer activist, which you are. But what I love is you're not one of those marriage equality basic hoes that just think it's all about being able to adopt a puppy or whatever the gays are doing nowadays, but also fighting for anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-violence, anti-war kind of agendas. And so I'm just curious if you can just kind of share some of your work as a queer activist and a veteran activist here in Chicago, and how housing got involved into that. Because I know you've been doing so much work for years around housing activism, particularly in Uptown.
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually got started as an anti-war activist in the late 1970s, and that's a whole story that we can talk about some other time. But really, the issues are so interconnected. You can't just talk about homelessness without talking about a whole bunch of things: race, class, capitalism. There's so many things that are interconnected, all the issues. And really, if you look at the high points of the LGBTQ movement, I'm talking about the movement that was birthed by the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969. The activists of that day weren't just gay rights only activists. They were what today we'd call intersectional. They were anti-war activists. They were anti-racist activists. They were activists against police brutality. They were supporting the Black Panthers. They were demonstrating against the Vietnam War. I mean, it was this whole notion that LGBTQ activism means you only give a shit about yourself is just so off base, and really I think has set the movement back immeasurably. And just through a series of experiences that I had, it drove me in the direction of that, shall we say, earlier tradition. That said, I think it's also important not to discount basic legal equality. My husband, whom a few of you saw earlier in the program before we got on the air here, he wouldn't have my employer provided health insurance unless we'd gotten hitched, So, but what we see often with movements, and certainly with the LGBTQ movement, is that when you win basic legal equality, a whole class of people, the A-list queens, if you will, say, we've got ours, sayonara, screw the rest of you. We just want to be equal with those of our class. But, we don't give a damn about, our LGBTQ server at our favorite restaurant or what have you. And we saw this in the Black civil rights movement, after the mid-1960s legislation, where a whole section of that movement has said, okay, we've got ours, we're going to build our Black business, and the rest of it. To his eternal credit, King said, no, there's a hell of a lot more here. And then the younger generation came along. Things like the Black Panthers popped, 3, 4, 5 years later. And so just because a whole section of gaydom has decided they've gotten theirs with, equal marriage rights, equal employment rights in most of our, major urban areas, doesn't mean that a radical LGBTQ movement can't reemerge. Certainly that was the history of the late 60s, early 70s. With the
of the 2018s, here it is.
Yeah, so you know, it's been a sort of weird path. How I got into homeless, rights organizing. I've generally been, working on anti-war issues and quote unquote national, international issues. I got a call one night from a dear friend of mine, Ryan Polker, who said the cops are about to arrest all of us. They were doing a homeless solidarity encampment down by the Lakeshore Drive viaduct here in Uptown, and they were threatened to arrest them, and Ryan knew that I had, shall we say, some encounters with the police over the years, and so on the spot developed a legal strategy whereby, at least for the time being, they couldn't kick our butts and get us out of there and arrest everyone. The commander on the scene, or I guess he was a lieutenant, was really pissed because we basically handed their hat to them that night. And the homeless tent cities in Uptown persevered for a couple of years after that until Rom kicked them all out. I guess it was September of 2017.
Yeah, so can you both give our audience a description, like who are the homeless and what are general misconceptions? Can we start with Maya first?
Yeah, so I think that when people think about who is unhoused and who homeless people are, they tend to imagine folks sleeping on the street or in a tent encampment or somehow, or maybe in a homeless shelter. The truth is that in the city of Chicago, there's every year there's a count of homeless people in the streets and in shelters, and it's about 5,000 to 6,000 people usually who are in those circumstances. But something like 85,000 people in the city of Chicago are actually homeless, and you just don't see it because people are living usually doubled up with relatives or friends. They're kind of bouncing around different temporary housing, and there's thousands of homeless children who are in Chicago public schools who don't have a permanent place to stay. There's tons of homeless workers. There's tons of homeless. There's tons of homeless parents. There's tons of homeless grandparents. So yes, there are folks who are sleeping on the street, who are not allowed access to shelters or aren't able to connect with, don't have any family or friends that they could stay with. But there's also the vast majority of people who don't have stable housing that they can rely on and afford, are relying on usually family and friend networks that are doing the job that if the state, if it was functioning correctly, could do a better job of doing.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I'd add to what Maya just said there is that some 29% of the homeless are employed, which says something about the economy that we live in. Introducing to the show, Lily here. And the CPS, the Chicago Public School System, reports something like 15,000 of their own registered students are homeless. Now, as Maya was saying, a lot of these folks are doubled up, which is, on one level, certainly it's better than living in the streets, but on another level, we can see, given that CPS is overwhelmingly Black and brown students, why all that forced cohabitation in tight quarters, families doubled up and so forth in the midst of COVID is a recipe for people getting ill and spread of the pandemic. As I was saying earlier, all these issues are connected. I mean, it's become something of a cliche that crises expose the deep underbelly of inequality in societies, but that's just one of many, many ways that the pandemic's crisis has exposed the rank inequality that we're facing. And when things hit in the fall and the winter, it's one thing. A lot more people are sleeping rough. Looking at this summer versus previous summers, a lot more people are sleeping rough because the shelters are dangerous. You're just a few feet away from cots on either side of you. A recipe, just like Cook County Jail or any other confined institution, a recipe for pandemic spread. So a lot of people are sleeping rough, and it's one thing to do that in June in Chicago. It's another thing to do that with a possible second wave of the pandemic in October or November.
It's living rough. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you use that expression, and rough means something very different to different people. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
I may be using a British term there,
Yeah.
but it's
wow, she is international. She's an international activist. She is the Queen's English right now. Okay, go ahead.
The Queen reads too many issues of The Economist. People living on the streets, basically. We have homeless encampments. I mentioned earlier that people have been booted out in, I believe it was September 2017 when we lost a federal court case. People are back at not just the Uptown 10 cities, which was getting a huge amount of press back in 2016, 2017, while they were representing literally just a tiny portion of the overall number of people who were living on the streets at the time. But because there was activism around it, it was a huge embarrassment to our anti-homeless alderman, James Kappelman, as well as Rahm. But now you've got people pretty openly living, sleeping rough, living rough underneath our viaducts of the major expressways, along the edges of the expressways, down by Roosevelt Road and so forth. And because the shelters are so damn dangerous right now with COVID, who can blame them? But a lot of people, that I talked to said, there's no way I would go to the shelter, especially Pacific Garden Mission, which, if you're LGBTQ, was just a hell house of, Bible thumping anti-LGBT bigotry.
That's right. But I know that shelter is right by where I live. Yeah. Jackson
A lot
Charles,
of people, when they get out of prison, that's the advice that the IDOC gives them is they give them a bus ticket to Chicago and they say, go to Pacific Garden. I've known a number of people who said that. They stay there one night. It's just so awful. They'd rather be on the streets.
Wow.
So Maya, you recently authored one part of a 2-part series in Chicago Reader on homelessness in the pandemic. I love the other article you did on Pangea. I refer to that shit a lot. It was like affirmation for like the Black community. Like, we been knew like this place was fucked up, but we just needed someone else to say that shit. So I'm totally like happy that you did that digging. But how would you just describe the issues around housing and homelessness in the climate of COVID-19?
Well, so as Andy said, this is like a time when people are particularly scared about being in a shelter situation, being confined with a bunch of other people in a closed space. Since the pandemic started, the city did take some steps to kind of decrease the congestion of some of the bigger shelters. They opened up like some additional facilities at YMCAs in the city to allow shelters to create some social distancing with like the beds and stuff. So people were transferred to different facilities. But the other big thing that's happened is the state moratorium on evictions and the shutdown of the county court system, so that you can't really file any eviction cases right now unless it's like in some extreme cases. And just today in the city council, there was a measure passed that would extend the state moratorium on evictions 60 days beyond when that will expire. So that's supposed to expire, I think, at the end of June. It's not too clear yet, but the city has decided that the moratorium would continue for another 60 days for people who are struggling to pay rent as a result of for COVID-related job loss, or if they were sick or whatever. So I would say that after all of these kind of protective measures expire, I think that we should expect to see like a giant wave of evictions in the city. Right now, one of the things that's really interesting, for example, about a landlord like Pangea, they have more than 400 buildings in the city, probably at this point close to 8,000 units, apartment units that they rent. They typically file like 1,000 cases a year, which is more than any other landlord in the city, and it's more than even landlords who have a lot more units than they do. So the vast majority of their cases, they filed because people haven't paid rent. And so what's kind of interesting about this whole moratorium is that there have been some eviction filings still. And the state kind of, the Governor Pritzker's order around this is that you can only file a case in case the tenant is like a danger to other tenants, is like, I guess, really destructive to the property, if there's some kind of extreme situation going on. And so there have been like a little bit of filings, and a few of the really, really big landlords, big corporate landlords have filed a few cases as well. But I'm talking about like maybe like half a dozen or a dozen cases for companies that oversee like 10,000 units. Pangea hasn't filed a single case since this moratorium has started, which just goes to show that, like, well, I mean, okay, it's good that they're not filing right now, but it just goes to show that they're only kicking people out that aren't paying rent. Because right now they can only file cases in extreme cases of like extreme situations of danger to others or property damage, and they're not filing cases over that. That means when they file cases, all those cases are people aren't able to pay rent. And so, you know, sure enough, since most of their holdings are concentrated in neighborhoods that are predominantly working class, Black neighborhoods, you know, Austin, Garfield Park, South Shore, Chatham. People have lost their jobs in a lot of these places. And I think that once the courts open back up again, that's the big thing that's stopping all this. Is like the courts aren't open, and they're not going to be open until right now. The closure is through July 6th. So I think that we can expect like a big wave of eviction cases. And as far as the renter protection ideas that are out there that would be more long-term, a lot of that stuff is really far from becoming real.
Mm.
Hey, Andy, since you have some historical context, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how affordable housing and public housing has kind of shifted to the private sector in the last few decades. I think it's something that we often don't think about, but I'd like to know what is the role of private entities in this whole thing, and also what are some ways that perhaps the city or the state could intervene to make this more equitable.
Well, I think the first thing that people have to realize, and if you're not old enough, you wouldn't know this, but homelessness has not always been with us in this country. If you go to Wikipedia, I believe they list the earliest homeless rights organization as having been founded in Philadelphia in 1981. It's actually incorrect. The Chicago Coalition for the Homeless was founded in 1980. What you saw is after the post-World War II boom in the economy started to really hit the skids in the 1970s, and then when Reagan came in and there was, combined with the kicking of people out of the mental health hospitals, which was a total mixed bag because they didn't get the services out in the community that they needed, but you had an explosion of homelessness beginning in the early 1980s. I mean, it says something about just how barbaric our country has become that I think a lot of young people growing up just assume we've always had homeless. It's like that old biblical phrase, the poor will always be with us. It's not true. The housing for many people, especially people of color, may have been totally miserable during the 50s and 1960s, but this phenomenon of lots of people out on the streets, a lot of people being doubled up and so forth, is really a new invention as capitalism has failed increasing numbers of people in the latter part of the 20th century. So for starters, you just got to say, this doesn't have to be, even within the confines of the capitalist economy, it doesn't have to be. We can look at other countries. Singapore, they've got a huge, I want to say it's 80% or 90% of the housing is public housing in Singapore. And according to economists, again, the damn British reference, it works pretty damn good for the people who live there. Now, it's not great for migrant laborers, as we've recently found out with the outbreaks of COVID amongst migrant workers in Singapore, but at least people that have been born there, the overwhelming majority of people live in what we in this country call public housing. You look at Hong Kong, which had a refugee crisis in the 1950s, and some 200,000 units of housing were created just within a couple of years. And just to give people some perspective, the affordable housing set aside, I was looking at some figures from that Ram was boasting about back in the day, and they said, "Oh, we created 134 units of affordable housing compared to 200,000 in Hong Kong." But it costs real money to get housing. This is something that the average public housing unit costs $200,000 to create back when the CHA was actually building it. Now, Maya has really done the research on this absolutely Byzantine private-public partnership. You know, it's like designed to obfuscate who is really responsible if the housing isn't good. And plus, this city, for the last couple of decades, I mean, they tore down the projects, especially in the 80s and 90s. It was part of a move to destroy public housing, especially close to the city core, because you don't want a lot of Black people living close to City Hall where they might march. I mean, we've seen that in the recent protests. They really don't like their downtown being messed with, and you put up the bridges and so forth. But this is an idea that Richard M. Daley, when he was traveling the world, as mayor, he looked at places like Paris, France, where you push all the people of color out to the periphery. And that's, you look at the huge decline of Black people in the city. Actually, probably the vast majority of them are going to these uber poor, under-resourced, even more under-resourced in the city Chicago suburbs, particularly, places like Dalton, Harvey, that are just a mess, and they don't give a shit, frankly. I mean, and those of us who are reading the Tribune every day and barfing as we did so during the 1980s, the Tribune would have this campaign to shut down Cabrini Green, which is now, of course, luxury housing. But there's a campaign, and they kept on saying, oh, these poor people, they're living in these horrible conditions. Well, if you don't maintain the damn thing for decades, if people don't have jobs, and of course, that whole situation of youth unemployment, especially, has just gotten worse. I mean, people of my generation, especially if you're white, back in the 70s, you could go out and get yourself a McJob. It wasn't great. And as a friend of mine always put it, minimum wage, minimum work. But at least it was a job, and you could actually somewhat support yourself. But the minimum wage, until very recently, in the moves for Fight for 15, has been a joke. There's no way you could support yourself, let alone dependence on minimum wage. So, that's a circuitous route, and maybe not answering your question. But
no, I think you covered a lot. I'm actually trying to figure out what you didn't cover. I have, in that question.
It was very informational.
I'm like, damn, I need to go look up some of this shit now. I'm into it. I think one of the questions I kind of want to throw out to both of you, right, is like, how is, so we're talking about COVID, we're talking about like homelessness, right? It's really great to get that kind of like genealogy. That's a word I learned in a thing called the doctorate program that I still got to finish, but I haven't found time to write even a chapter in my dissertation. Just thought you wanted to know that. But let's talk about, but when we're talking about, this homelessness in Chicago, and we're talking about the pandemic, how would, either of you or both of you actually kind of qualify how the city is responding to housing and homelessness, in Chicago? We've had a couple people on talking specifically about some of the issues like around rent and things like that. But what would you all, what are you all seeing and or researching? Maya, you got two screens. Can the audience see your other screen?
This is the other screen.
Yo, she was in an editorial meeting doing research while she was talking to us. She just really wanted to do good reporting, be up to date with her facts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so this is up to the hour updates for you about what's happening with the city of Chicago. There was a city council meeting today at which the city blocked a just cause eviction. I mean, Lori Lightfoot's kind of allied alderman blocked two very kind of high profile important ordinances. One was a just cause eviction ordinance. I'll explain that in a second. The other one was an ordinance proposing to get cops out of Chicago public schools. Both of them are now shuttled into the rules committee where they say legislation goes to die. But
very round-like.
Yeah. So as far as one of the things that's been happening in the city for several years now is there's been a movement that's started by something called the Lift a Ban Coalition, which is a coalition of community groups fighting to lift the statewide ban on rent control. And no one is proposing that we set some kind of ceilings on how high rent can be. But the idea is that if this ban was lifted, we could maybe have some regulations at the city level that would prohibit rent from going up super fast in 1 year, for example, that people would not be displaced as a result of real estate market fluctuations and rents going up, and it would kind of help neighborhoods not gentrify so fast. So the reason we have this ban in Illinois is because in the 90s, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which is sort of like this shadowy group that brings together this unholy alliance of state legislators and giant special interest groups and industry groups at these super fancy junkets, all over the country, in which these state legislators are kind of wined and dined and treated to a bunch of seminars, and it's an all expenses paid trip. And the industry groups get to say, hey, how about this piece of legislation? It would be really great for you to propose this in your state house. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a big push from ALEC to create preemptive bans on any kind of rent regulation, because there had already been rent control that had been pretty well established, and rent regulation that had been established in places like New York and San Francisco. But there were other cities that started to try to enact various forms of regulation on how fast rent can go up. In other places in the country. And so seeing this, the ALEC people were like, okay, let's see if we can just have the states, because they didn't expect that they could get some kind of federal intervention on this. So they wanted the states to pass these laws that would just say, you can't regulate rent on commercial and residential properties. You just can't do that. So Illinois was one of a bunch of different states that literally has an identical, word for word identical state law about this. It comes straight from the ALEC handbook. And so for the last few years, there's been this push to repeal this ban. And there are a couple of different bills in Springfield in the State House. One is just a bill that would just repeal the ban. It doesn't do anything else. It would just say okay, we don't have this ban anymore, which would then allow local governments in cities to decide if they wanted to do something about this. There's another bill that proposes actually establishing rent control in the state, and it's kind of a complicated system that they would propose, but essentially it would there would be these committees that would kind of decide how much rent can increase every year. There would be tax incentives for smaller landlords to do property maintenance in case and get assistance from the state if somehow they weren't able to afford to do that because of the rent not being high enough. So in tandem with this push for us to be able to have rent regulation, which there's like a billion right-wing talking points about how rent control is a bad idea that can all be very easily found and Googled. I did an article about this a couple of years ago called The Secret History of Illinois Rent Control Ban. If you just Google secret history rent control, Chicago Reader, you'll find it. That where I explain like what the objections to rent control are, and what the problems with those objections are, and how they can be, how like, you know, other perspectives on this issue. But in tandem with this rent control, with this push for rent control, there's been this push to create a just cause eviction law, at least in Chicago. And that would mean that landlords can't evict people without cause, without a good reason. So if a person is compliant with their lease, if they are current on their rent, then a landlord can't ask them to leave just because somebody is, you know, they want to like rehab the property and rent it out at a higher rate. I think I just saw Jackie. Did you raise your hand? I don't know what that icon was.
She did some claps. She did some claps.
Okay.
My favorite thing was like when Jackie, sometimes her connection gets faint, so then we just see the name. But in my mind, I'm always imagining things she's doing. Like sometimes I imagine her like cussing somebody out on her porch or making a taco in the kitchen.
You're not wrong.
You know, if I could just add something to Maya's excellent history there, a fun fact about the history of rent control legislation. It may have been your article that I read way back in the day, Maya. But when Alex first came to Illinois, one of the houses and the governorship was controlled by the Republicans.
Both of them were.
Oh, both of them were.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, it was probably your article. Came in, and the liberals raised a ruckus. You know, these horrible people are coming in to ram this right-wing legislation down our throats. You know, let's get all upset. And then when the Democrats took control of both houses and the governorship, it passed.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's your neoliberal Democrats for you, fighting. So long as it's fighting against Republicans.
Yeah. So, I mean, so this, just to finish my point about the just cause. So basically there's been an ordinance at the city level that was introduced today to establish just cause eviction. So it doesn't mean that a landlord can't evict the tenant if the tenant isn't paying rent or is tearing up the property or whatever. It just means that if the reason you want people to leave is because you're trying to rehab the place and re-rent it, or you yourself are gonna move in there, or you want a relative to move in there, you need to pay people a relocation fee. And the ordinance, like, so Mayor Lightfoot has been in conversation with the people who, the Housing Justice League, which is sort of the coalition of groups that have been working on this ordinance. And they were under the impression she was in support of this thing. And they were getting pretty close to having like an agreement from her about like all of the different points of the ordinance. And they kind of were under the impression that this could go through. And then at last month's city council meeting, she basically like introduced a different ordinance that they're calling the Fair Notice Ordinance, which doesn't establish just cause eviction. It just says that if somebody's getting evicted without cause, they need to be given 90 days to move instead of 30 days to move. And they in case that they're getting evicted because the landlord wants to do major rehab on the property, then the landlord has to pay them like $2,500. And so all the progressive aldermen who had been in support of the Just Cause Ordinance and the groups that were working on it were really pissed about this, because it was like kind of a competing and like kind of watered down version of what they had wanted. So they immediately moved to like move this piece of legislation into the Rules Committee where things normally go to die. But today I learned that this bill was like magically moved out of the Rules Committee, which almost never happens. So it's now in the Housing Committee, and I guess could be up for a full vote from the council next month. So meanwhile, the Just Cause bill that was introduced today immediately got sent to Rules, and I'd be very surprised if that made it out of that committee. So because it's a mayor's handpick aldermanic ally that controls the Rules Committee and calls meetings and decides essentially if something is going to make it out of there. So that's where we're at with that. So not clear if we're going to have like a real discussion debate about the Just Cause ordinance. The mayor's fair notice ordinance does provide some relief to people. I don't want to say that this is nothing. I mean, some of the progressive aldermen feel like it's not enough, so therefore we shouldn't even have this. Other groups are like, okay, we'll take this and then we want more. The landlords are opposed to all of it because it's just a change to the status quo, and they're always opposed to any kind of change to the status quo. And besides that, in terms of the COVID related like relief for housing, besides the eviction moratorium and the kind of expansion of some shelters, there was this whole splashy thing about like using hotel rooms, but it's not really to provide housing for people. It's to provide temporary places to stay for people who've already been diagnosed or who are recovering after being in the hospital. So it's really not like a thing that's going to help people get permanent housing. Does that answer your question?
That was a very robust answer. I love that you gave us the history of rent control. It's very useful. I could tell that you were learning, been doing the job, and I am ashamed of myself because I just was drinking most of my life. All right, so Andy, and then how about, I mean, like anything that you're seeing as well? Like, I'm also just wondering, like, Maya gave us that breakdown. What are some of the ways that the city, so if it's not the hotels, if it's not, even when we talk about housing, it is, we can say it's only 5,000, 6,000 people, but that's still a lot of people, right? Like what relief is the city kind of providing to them? Or is it just like get your ass in a shelter or live rough and hope for the best?
Well, slight improvement over ROM in that at least some of the homeless encampments, they have set up sanitation stations so people can wash their hands, which is really critical in this pandemic, so that people can have at least a modicum of sanitary access. But a lot of what Maya was saying in terms of this isn't permanent solutions. This is actually a shell game that we've seen over and over again from the city. Like, people may remember Alderman Kappelman's boasts about all the people that were staying at the uptown tent cities got quote unquote permanent housing. It was an absolute lie. What they do is they put them in some temporary housing where for the first period the city pays 100% of the rent, then it goes down to 75, then it goes down to 50, and then it goes out. In other words, you can say, oh, we've solved the problem. And what it means is people who are on fixed incomes, at a certain point, their SSI check is not going to cover the really basic housing that they've got. But the city can claim we've solved the problem, the homeless encampments at Lakeshore Drive. And when the second wave hits, if it does, in terms of COVID this fall, combined with the things that Maya's talking about in terms of, what relief there's been ending. I mean, remember, people could defer rent, but that rent is still due on top of their current rent, and all this stuff hitting in the fall in the midst of a potential second wave with the colder weather, and it being much more difficult to sleep rough. Then you've really got a perfect storm potentially coming. And I think that people have to get very angry, much more angry, but angry along the lines of what we've seen in terms of the Black Lives Matter protest. I mean, I've always had, shall we say, a love-hate relationship with these drives for rent control, frankly, because I don't think they go far enough. It's great to prevent huge increases in rents that's clearly needed in places like along the 606 or Pilsen and whatever. But the basic thing you absolutely need is a huge increase in the housing stock. this city has pursued a many decades long policy in cahoots with the private real estate industry to destroy public housing. That's why you get rid of Robert Taylor Home, you get rid of Greeny Green et al. And what it means is that the housing stock that's left, you can charge a hell of a lot more for. The CHA was a big competitor to the private real estate market. And now their idea of taking care of some level of affordable housing is not to actually build more affordable housing and thus drive down rents, not just for the poorest of the poor, but frankly, everyone on this call here and probably most of your viewers, you know, they sold the destruction of public housing about, don't worry, white people. It's about those people who are getting rid of their housing, Cabrini Green. I mean, it was that blatant, the Chicago Tribune. It still makes me angry decades later. They sold it to people that way. And what it was doing, it was a total divide and conquer thing, because everyone in this city, unless you're a yuppie, unless you're making six figures, you suffer when they destroy affordable housing, because you got that many more people chasing fewer units of housing. And so what we really need to do is to push for a massive affordable housing campaign in this country and in this city. And it can be done. The history of the 1930s movements, when radicals were when the sheriff evicted people, radicals in the neighborhood could get together, the Communist Party and others, and they put all the furniture back in the house. And it was that kind of direct activism we saw in that era that forced the city to build things like Lathrop Homes, which today is being turned into yuppified housing, of course, with token affordable. But it can be, they did it during the Great Depression. Okay, people were mobilized in the way that we see in the streets here today in terms of Black Lives Matter. People were demanding change, and as much as the authorities didn't want to give it, because people were persistent and they were in the streets, they had to give it. And so I think we as activists need to stop trimming our sails. We need to not just go for the legal remedies, the changing the laws that cost them maybe a little bit of money. We got to go for the big bucks, and we can do it. History shows that we can do it. In response to the Black Panthers, the city, Richard Nixon of all people, poured all sorts of money into the cities, not because he liked Black people and brown people, but because he was scared shitless. And the White House transcripts prove that later in the day. So we can do it is my message, and we should not. We should, yes, go for rent control, get it, but don't be satisfied with it, because we can win a hell of a lot more. And until we actually have a huge increase in affordable housing stock in this city, we're going to have people sleeping rough. We're going to have people worrying about whether or not they can make next month's rent, even when we're not in a pandemic. And things have just gotten worse with this Great Recession. I mean,
you know, I just want to bring up the CHA if I can as well. Andy's point is important, and I feel like in this moment, in this pandemic moment, there's been like a kind of real resurgence in conversation around like, what's the CHA doing? There are so many vacant units in the CHA, and there was another ordinance that was supposed to be introduced today but wasn't for some reason that's like some kind of bureaucratic hiccup. But basically there's like 1,400 units of vacant public housing that could be brought back online to house people that is not available because the housing authority, is not like under city control, and they're not really under federal control either, because in the early 2000s, for Richard M. Daley to do his big plan for transformation and destroy all this public housing, he went to Washington, D.C. and got a sweetheart deal from George W. Bush to let them basically remove like federal oversight over the CHA. So the federal government still gives them money for all these public housing units that they run, whether or not they're occupied. And there's really no accountability, or they're deregulated essentially. And so there's no real pressure from the feds for the CHA to lease up this housing. And the city doesn't really have any control over the CHA either. They don't fund the agency. The only little leverage that the city has is that when it comes to like 1,400 of these vacant units, and there's more than 1,400 vacant CHA units, but there's 1,400 vacant affordable housing units that are in developments that are co-developed by the CHA and private partners. And the city is able to have some little bit of leverage in terms of requiring a certain level of occupancy if they're going to approve a development. And so this ordinance that the Chicago Housing Initiative is working on would make it so that the city could exercise some pressure for the CHA to actually make sure these units are leased up. But it hasn't even been introduced yet. So the thing is, like, the situation that we have on our hands today, where there's like so much affordable, so much vacant land or vacant housing, and also so many homeless people, vacant affordable housing units and vacant public housing units, and hundreds of thousands of people on the waiting list. All of these circumstances exist this way because there's like a tremendous thicket of very complicated laws and bureaucratic rules that govern how the system works. Right. And that obscure like our ability to just directly change things that we can see with our eyes are messed up.
Yeah, it's like a submerged, there's a term in cultural studies called the submerged state, which is actually speaking to like the way, to exactly what you're saying is like these legislations, like this amount of legislation that is buried the ways to actually kind of like make change, because then you're just like even repealing and undoing and just to get to a point where you could kind of like move forward in a certain way. But I also think part of that has worked in the benefit of power, not just in that it makes it stagnant, but also in the way that they can remove themselves from accountability. So if you look at one of the things that she's been doing, when it came down to housing, she's like, well, that's not actually a city thing. You got to talk to Pritzker. And Pritzker's like, well, that's actually not a state thing. That's kind of this. And then when we think about even recently right now with the cops out of schools, her fallback on that was like, actually,
it's the city council, it's the local school councils.
Councils. And so what we're seeing is like a way in which like power has learned how to it's actually a decentralization of where to look for accountability, that we've seen. And that's a fragmentation that then leaves people running in between, shuttling back and forth to find the solution, when like, they don't need that type of council or those bureaucracies. They actually are non-existent for so many other things that they want to subsidize or realize, right? Like the Lincoln Yards, like you just need the aldermen to rubber stamp it, which is what they did. So it's kind of,
the thing that happens, I feel like all the time, is like you have demands are being made on the streets and pressures being applied to elected officials by organizers and groups of constituents, and then a lot of times like the elected officials themselves, like especially like state legislators or city council members, are not necessarily like super educated about how the system works. So then they're faced with the demands from the street, and then they go to someone who is like, people that they work with who are well versed about this stuff, who know how the legislative process works, who know how these laws works. And then those people will say, well, we can't do this, that, and the other because of like this confluence of different regulations and laws, and this is like against the state law in Springfield, and this is against the Constitution, and you need a referendum for this, that, and the other. And at the end of the day, it's like all of that stuff that like the experts will tell the elected officials about why something can't get done is true, but also it's filtering people's demands through that, like, oh, we can't do that because of this, that, and the other. Like it's like releases a pressure valve essentially, and a lot of people will lose steam because they think like, oh well, like we just can't do that. So my point is always that I feel like it's really important to know the system, to like know how the system works, and to when the elected officials turn around and tell you like, oh, we can't do that because XYZ reason, you have to like be like 5 steps ahead, because you have to and I see this all the time in organizing in Chicago, like people know how this works, they do their research, and they can say like, no, we want a referendum, like put a referendum on the ballot about this so we can change the law, so we can have, you know, whatever civilian oversight of the police. So, you know, it is like this invisible state. It is like this like thicket, you know, this like kind of thicket of roots underneath what we see on the surface. But it is possible to, you know, to intervene in there. You just have to speak their language. You have to know the language that they're speaking.
Hey, Maya, or Andy, I'm sure you have been following the development in Logan Square by the Blue Line, right? Which is supposed to be like the most recent model of affordable housing done right, right? I think 100% is supposed to be affordable units. It's close to public transportation, an attractive place. An attractive location with community input. Can you tell us more about what that affordable housing development entails, and like what are the good aspects of it, and what are some aspects that need work?
Well, I mean, for the first time, it seems we're getting transit-oriented development for people who really are dependent on public transit. I mean, that's a breath of fresh air. I mean, we've got transit-oriented development happening in my ward here in Uptown that's for yuppies, the people who've got their cars and so forth, who can, you know, dial up a Lyft or an Uber at the drop of a hat. And so I don't know all the details about it, but it certainly faced opposition from the local real estate industry to have that. And fortunately, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears as though it's going through. So that is a huge breath of fresh air. But I'd like to go back to something that Maya was saying. I mean, when they throw these thickets of bureaucracies at us, and I've seen it in police accountability with COPA, with IPRA, with OOPS, any number, you know, command channel review. There was always another agency you had to appeal to in order to get rid of a transparently brutal police officer. And they play this game and they expect us to fall for it. And one of the brilliant things about the demand for CPAC, Civilian Police Accountability Council, is they said, let's cut through the crap. Let's cut through this nonsensical bureaucracy that is set up purposely to not only shield these officers, but there's a lot of upper middle class people like our current mayor who live in that bureaucracy and get big wages off that bureaucracy and ultimately defend these cops. And I think we're seeing the same thing. This is the beauty of privatization in their view. You look at what it does to the cleanliness of our public school system when Sodexo and whoever other, you know, slimy outfits that also conveniently service our prisons get hold of it. You know, the quality goes way down. You fire union workers. People are contingent workers who may not know whether or not their contract's going to be renewed, or the firm that they work for is going to have its contract renewed with the city. You know, if they unionize, for example. And I think at a certain level, you know, we've got to stop playing their game. I agree with you, Maya. We have to research this. We have to know what we're doing about, but it becomes, frankly, a full-time job. I mean, an attorney showed me this huge flow chart once about all the different channels that firing a cop had to go through, and if this and that. It was like this huge, you know, ledger-sized piece of paper with all these PowerPoint boxes on it about what happened, and maybe way at the end of the day you might get rid of the brutal cop. And I think at a certain point we have to say, yes, you have to understand how the system works, but you also got to say, let's cut through the crap. Let's cut through all these mayoral flunkies appointed to a one. And say that a simplified system would not only allow for much more justice in this city, but also it would save taxpayer money. You know, the real estate industry, when we're talking about, you know, why things are so Byzantine in terms of CHA and so forth. It used to be actually relatively simple back in the day. There was CHA, it was responsible for the housing. They did a lousy job. But that's where you could organize. It was clear who the enemy was. But when you have all these public-private partnerships, it purposely breaks up the struggle between people in this set of housing versus that set of housing. It makes it much more difficult to have a unified struggle for housing for all. But I think you look at the current situation in terms of affordable housing, it's not an accident. It's not just a failure of, oops, this happened this way. You look at how the overwhelming majority of older people get elected in this city, it's with real estate money. That's where the big bucks come. And they make sure that people like my own Alderman Kappelman keep getting reelected as best they can. He barely squeaked in last time.
13 votes.
Yeah.
13 votes. So no matter how much real estate money he got 13, it was 13 people didn't show up to the polls, Yeah. 13 extra people. So that's the wonderful thing about local politics, though, is that at this level of the kind of, city council of Chicago, where you have elections where just a few thousand people are voting these people in, no matter how much real estate money there is, you have to get bodies to the polls, or I guess, the absentee ballot into the mailbox at this point. And there's only so much money can buy you when the scale is so small, which, in a way, it's like, it allows for democracy to thrive if people can actually get mobilized.
There's a couple of things I want to talk about right now that are very important. One, Andy, I love how you started off this show being in a lefty space, and now it looks like a wizard in Harry Potter with this uplighting right here.
I have no problem with the lighting in here.
And the other thing is, I got a little bit distracted because Rosana Rodriguez was texting me. I just want to let her know I am doing the show. Leave me alone. And then I think the other thing I was thinking about too is I do think Maya, you kind of started touching on it, right? And we're at time a little bit, so I want to kind of close out. But you were saying even this idea of voting at a smaller scale, right? And so I think one of the that's something to look out for. Kappelman, we are coming for you. I don't live in your ward, but I'll make a friend there and tell them to vote against you. All right, but I'm thinking what are some of the things that right now people can do, or that they need to be aware of or on guard about regarding housing and homelessness in COVID-19? Oh, wow. Now you two don't know who's going to go first? What's going on?
I thought it was Maya.
Andy.
I just talked, so I thought it was Maya's turn. But, I think it should be really clear that the streets around our city really show the way. We haven't gotten the tremendous gains in this city that you've seen right around the country. I mean, in city after city, I saw this long list that a BLM activist put out a few days ago about all the different cops who were fired, all the different cops who have been criminally prosecuted. The introduction of the idea of defunding the cops is now a mainstream idea, where it was this fringe, just a few weeks ago. You can thank the protest for that. I mean, that's how change was made. That's how the change was made in the 30s. That's how the change was made in the 60s, early 70s. That, this is when people get all bound up about these national elections with one orange jerk running against another person who reminds me of Paul van Hindenburg. You can Wikipedia that guy.
Whoa,
the guy who became chancellor instead of president of Germany instead of Hitler, and then he just handed it off to Hitler. But whatever, So Biden, when I see Biden in his barely cognizant state, I think of Paul von Hindenburg. But whatever, that's an historical reference. The point is that the youth are showing the way, and this whole thing directly connects to housing, because these cops, for starters, cost our city $140,000 per year in salary and benefits. That's just for starters. As they go up the ranks, they cost more. A unit of affordable housing costs about $200,000. I frankly would like to have not the third highest cop per capita ratio of any city over 50,000 people in the country that we currently have, and spend that money on a hell of a lot of affordable housing, because I think we've going to have a much more healthier city in every neighborhood, and just not the north side, if we start spending that money. And I think this is just brilliant, the way that the youth and the Black Lives Matter movement have forced these issues into the public agenda, even though that's the last place that certainly the Republicans want it, but also our neoliberal Democrats. And it's interesting because, of course, Lori's saying she's not for defunding the police. Certainly Biden's saying he's not for defunding the police. And let's remember that a lot of these BLM protests, most of them are taking off in cities led by Democratic Party mayors. So as much as I hate and I loathe Trump, the violent racist that he is, it was how many years of neoliberalism that paved the way for him. And we got to have something very different, or else 4 years from now, we're going to be looking at someone perhaps even worse than Trump. I mean, in my lifetime, people thought you couldn't get any worse than Richard Milhouse Nixon, or you couldn't get any stupider than George W. Bush. But gosh, we've managed to do it. We got Trump. Okay, so we got to get off this treadmill of just getting one horrible person after another, interspersed with some milk toast. Let's do a little reform around the edges, when the kind of reform that we need, not just in terms of police violence, but in terms of the planet, in terms of people's incomes and so forth, it just pales by comparison to what these guys are offering.
Right. All right. And Maya, what do you think is one of the things people can do, or they need to be on guard about?
So I guess I will say, there's something that I think people need to know in terms of individual stuff, and then stuff like other things in terms of collective stuff. And I would say that given that there's going to be this wave of evictions, that many of us might be facing eviction or know people who are, a very, very important thing to know in that context is that eviction court works at lightning speed. The courts are going to be really, really overwhelmed with cases, since there's been months that landlords have not been able to file. And I think it's going to be more important than ever for people to really understand their rights and know that they don't need, you need legal representation in there if you're gonna have any chance of coming out of it without an eviction on your record or a money judgment against you that'll ruin your credit history. So I just want to put it out there that there's tons of legal aid organizations in the city. They're all overwhelmed, but they're staffed with very qualified and good lawyers that provide legal aid for free. There's also private eviction defense lawyers who tend to charge people quite, several $100s to represent them. But according to the data and a data analysis has come out against this, the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing has a data portal on eviction data that shows this, that people tend to get better results with legal aid lawyers than they do with private attorneys. So there's a link that was, I think, put into the comments, or maybe it's going to go up there, but I did a little story about this data, and in that story there's a list of legal aid groups and all the various things they specialize in.
You've done a story on everything.
Well, so I just want to say that there are resources out there. If you're getting sent to eviction court, there are resources out there for free, and you shouldn't think that they're bad just because they're free. So, a lot of people get a flyer, like an advertisement from a private defense attorney that'll charge them money and not necessarily do much for them before they even get a court summons. So I just always put it out there that there are people who can help you for free, and you can get good advice and help from them. So legal aid organizations are really good in the city. The other thing I wanted to say is that there are a lot of what I'm seeing a lot of is tenant unions forming around the city. So the Autonomous Tenants Union has, I think, kind of helped a lot of people start tenant unions in their buildings, in their neighborhoods. And there's also lots of like organically groups are popping up organically all around town as well. I also did a story about this a little earlier on in the pandemic. It was a story, I'll put a link in here now, but it's a story about what the landlords were talking about on their Zoom calls, but also in there's links to various organizing documents for tenant unions and some interviews with people who are forming tenants unions in different parts of town. So whatever you're going through right now, it's likely there are other people that are going through it too. And I feel like I've never seen a moment in the city where people were so mobilized and organized around the issue of like, let's think collectively about our kind of class position as renters and what kind of demands we can make collectively. And of course, the landlords tend to respond in a way that all union busting entities respond to union demands, which is that, you know, we'll handle it on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, there's a lot of organizing happening around this and a lot of resources out there for people. So yeah.
Thank you so much. So everyone, I want to thank our guests. Yes, bring that light on. It was like you both ended up in the house of Slytherin. So let's give it up for our guest, Andy Thayer. And let's give it up for Maya Dukmasova. Did I say it right? I did it right? I'm so good. I'm good at everything. Speaking of being good, Jackie Serrato, Editor-in-Chief, Southside Weekly. How about you give us our updates for the week?
Sure. So as you know, and as Maya mentioned, the City Council has been meeting remotely, digitally, and today they decided to recognize Juneteenth, which is a day in June to commemorate the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. However, the council fell short of calling it a city holiday, while other places like Virginia are beginning to recognize it as a paid holiday.
They said it would cost $100 million or something.
They did?
Yeah, I heard.
That's what they said. I don't know where that number is coming from, but they're saying that it will cost the city $100 million to make it a holiday. I don't know. Sorry.
Just stay home.
No, that's important.
But we have fucking Pulaski Day. I'm just
exactly.
And you know you're doing bad.
Columbus Day.
You know you're doing bad when Virginia is like, actually, we gotta recognize this. And Chicago's like, no, we really shouldn't. Sorry, Jax.
It's all good. I was just going to say that this move reminded me of the existing push to convert Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, right? And the effort was denied thanks to certain white aldermen in the council. All of this to say that there's a lot of decolonizing that needs to happen in City Hall, but there are campaigns and there are proposals on the table. Meanwhile, outside City Hall and the Thompson Center, protesters were loudly demanding community control of the police through CPAC, the Civilian Accountability Council, which would be a representative body that would replace an appointed body known as COPA to have oversight of the police. The mayor has created a task force to evaluate CPD's use of force, but it falls short, according to people. CPAC would have more powers, such as hiring and firing the police chief, right? Also in Woodlawn, activists critical of the Obama Center have camped out for days in what they call Lori Lightfoot's tent city as a way to shame her and also pressure the mayor to negotiate a community benefits agreement or CBA. I think it's a very creative way to show how if this development goes unchecked, it will displace long-life residents who are living in the lakefront or near the lakefront. And it is working to an extent because the organizers and the mayor have started to sit down and negotiate. Also, in response to a WBZ investigation that showed that there's a massive disparity between the bank loans given to white people versus Black people, activists have been demonstrating in front of different Chase branches. Chase Bank has apparently only imparted 1% of their loans to the Black community. And so these activists were able to shut down several branches in the last few days. And they're demanding $1 billion in loans or grants, and 10 billion in loans that would be made out to Chicago's Black communities. And finally, tomorrow there's a caravan. We've heard of defund CPD, of abolish ICE, and now there's a defund Cook County Jail caravan action, which is all related to everything we've been talking about, as well as a call to take police out of Chicago public schools. This action is going to take place between 9:30 and 11 a.m., but feel free to follow Black Lives Matter Chicago for more details.
Yes, thanks so much. Let's give it up for Jackie, and check out your weekly issue of the Southside Weekly. They come out weekly, y'all. That's why it's called Southside Weekly. She is killing the game over there and really covering some stories with ethical journalism, and also with some kind of with a non-racist, non-milquetoast, as Andy said, lens, a neoliberal democratic corporate media lens. Look at that. You thought I was speaking Spanish because you're racist. But let's we got to the end of the show, and let's give it up for the homie Charles, who's going to provide this week's Rona reflection.
In her 2019 article on Pangea, Maya quotes Matthew Desmond's 2016 book, Eviction. Quote, "Eviction affects Black women at about the same rate as incarceration affects Black men, and that it can plunge low-income households facing an unexpected financial emergency into an unstoppable cycle of poverty." End quote. This is disgusting. Latest figures say that there are currently 16,000 CPS students without a permanent home. In May 2020, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless released this annual study that concluded 76,998 Chicagoans were homeless in 2018. 76% of these homeless residents lived doubled up in the homes of others due to hardship, often in overcrowded conditions. It's disgusting. But what makes me full of disgust is not just the fact that this problem exists, but that it's normal and intentional. It's absolutely bizarre that we can expect homelessness in this city, this state, this country. We can identify people within our own lives who needed a place to stay, who have slept in cars, and who didn't have a place to go at some point in time. I'm a simple person, and the shit just doesn't make sense. I'm seeing downtown high-rises being built, wealthy developments approved in City Hall, new homes constructed in gentrified areas, yet homelessness or houselessness is a thing. But this is typical of capitalism, to place a human right on the market, to wait for property values to lower and for communities to be displaced in order to buy where people once lived and created memories, like their first Christmas or Sunday dinner. If housing is a human right, then we must internalize that the state is committed to denying the fullness of humanity. There are people on the ground with this shit. We can go back to 1966, Chicago's open housing movement. King literally had to get assassinated for the 68 Fair Housing Act to be signed by the U.S. Congress. We can fast forward to the now, where Cheryl Johnson of Oakdale Gardens Public Community Housing, whose mother trained Barack Obama in community organization, told Lori Lightfoot, and I quote, "House some people. We're dying on the streets." During a caravan protest to advocate CHA to open its doors for the homeless. They have always heard us, have always known homelessness to be a crisis. Let's forego grace and indict. It's time to say no more and never again when it comes to homelessness. No bullshit. I think we have some dark days ahead. I don't know what the homeless population will look like during or after COVID in the winter months. I don't know how many people will have to go through eviction court and that daunting process after the city's ban on eviction ends. But what I do know is that we must not fall into reflecting the intentional negligence of the powers that be. Instead, let's continue to employ radicality, love. A home shouldn't be political. Housing is a human right, and it's always time to assert that shit.
Go Charles, thank you so much. Andy liked it a lot.
I'm an atheist, but all I can say is amen.
I say fag because, I like it. I think that's holy. I want to give it up for Charles. I also want to give it up one more time for my co-host, Jackie. And I want to give it up especially for our guests. Thank you all so much. I'm so honored to have both of you here. We had such a great time And I hope you guys will come back on the show again, because I'm going to try and find every excuse to bring you back on. So that's it. Everybody else, thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next Wednesday. We're going to be looking at activists that are on the ground with defund the police movement. They will include the Hoodoisie's own and her own Christiana Ray Colon, as well as others. And then we'll be following that episode up with looking at the elderly. So just some previews for the next couple of weeks. Also, check out the Zoomoisie episodes we've been dropping, which is when we commission people to go ahead and do their own Hoodoisie episode. We provide them some media training and some interview training. And if you're interested in that, let us know. Just hit us up in the DMs. You get paid. And it's important for us to get other aspects of the crisis out there. Also, we are we're developing an archive of mutual aid projects because if we don't tell our stories and record this radical history of how we were helping each other, they would rather have it be repressed. So you can email any stories of any mutual aid you're doing or everyone you see doing by sending it to holdingitdown606 at gmail.com. And I'm forgetting a few things, but I'm okay because it's 8:54. I've been holding my urine for about an hour. I'm on a juice cleanse, yo. And I love everybody on this Zoom. I love everybody that's watching right now. And I cannot wait to see you all next week. Thanks so much.